Welcome back to Outside the Cage. I'm your host, Larken Rose. Okay, I'm guessing that at the conclusion of the story that we just finished in the last segment, probably a bunch of listeners were rather shocked and offended by the implication, the analogy. Here is what I want you to consider. What something is called, as we've discussed on prior episodes of the show, has nothing to do with what it is. What you call something does not change what it is. Now, the purpose of that story, which you could probably guess, was to show that if slaves are told, you're not working for me, your master, you're working for yourselves, does that change the reality of the situation? No, they're still slaves, they still have a master. If the master says, no, we're in this together and we're working together and you're just paying your share so that you can be provided from the common good, your food and your clothes and your housing and all that, does that change the nature of the situation? No. Is there anything in the world that Mr. Jones, our hypothetical plantation owner, could say which would change the actual situation? No, not unless he actually changed what was happening. So, I hope you noticed that the entire story wasn't about the situation of the slaves actually changing at all in any really substantial way. It was all about how their situation was described to them. That if you describe a situation in a way that makes it sound pleasant and makes it sound like it's more fair, it's more just, it's more free, then essentially you can take a really bad situation and convince people that it's good. But the underlying nature of how things are, that doesn't change. It doesn't make any difference what you call it and how you describe it. And if you go through that short little hypothetical story, I hope you notice the parallels with what we are taught as civics in this country. For example, we're taught we're in charge because we choose who is in office. Well, what difference does that make? We choose who is in office, who will then take our money for things whether we want them or not, and will tell us what to do and control our behaviors. That doesn't make us free. In fact, I believe it was Lysander Spooner who specifically pointed out that the fact that you can choose a new master in a term of years doesn't make you any more free, as we saw in our little story. So the fact that we can vote and we can speak out and we can ask our masters to please let us do things, please let us keep more of our money, that doesn't make us free. It doesn't have anything to do with the reality of the situation. It only has to do with our perceptions. What you call something doesn't matter. Now, here's a point that's going to bother a lot of people, even though the logic is extremely simple and unavoidable. What is an income tax? That is where a group of people calling themselves government say, we get to decide what percentage of what you earn that you have to give to us. Now, they don't say 100%, just like no slave owner was ever stupid enough to say, I'm taking 100% of what my slaves make, because the result of that would be the slaves die. The slaves have to be allowed to keep enough that they can feed themselves and house themselves, or they die. The slave masters didn't let them keep some because they were nice guys. They let them keep some because otherwise their livestock would die. That was their view of it. An income tax is accepting the notion that there is a ruling class that has the right to tell you how much of what you earn you are allowed to keep. There is another word for that. It's called slavery. Now, most Americans aren't going to want to admit that they are in fact slaves, so they will deny that it's the same things. Well, we get services for that, like your hut and your food, and the things that the plantation gives to its slaves to keep them alive and keep them healthy and content enough that they can continue to be enslaved and worked really hard. But the essential nature of the arrangement is exactly the same. If you have somebody who decides how much he's going to let you keep of what you earn, you are that person's slave. And it doesn't matter how you describe it. Doesn't matter what you call it. That is the essential nature of slavery, that someone else decides how much of your labor he'll let you keep and how much he's going to take from you. That's slavery. Now, we weren't raised to view that as slavery because our slave masters are as smart as Mr. Jones. They're smart enough to know we cannot tell these people that they are slaves because they won't put up with it. We have to put new words and new rhetoric and new euphemisms and new propaganda around all of this to keep the situation the same, where you have a parasitic group that forcibly takes the products of the labor of millions of other people who actually produce all of the wealth. Government doesn't produce any of the wealth. Have the same situation, but we have to pitch it in such a way that people perceive it drastically differently so that we can actually get away with it. Now, another big difference between slavery in the 1800s and what we have today, we are a lot more comfortable. We have a lot more freedom of movement. We have a lot more toys. We have air conditioning, and we have a lot more comfortable lives. But guess what? That doesn't have anything to do with whether someone is a slave or not. Back in the days of open slavery, some of the slaves were told, you're allowed in the house. You can dress in much better clothes. You can eat much better food. You can have a much more comfortable life. You will be a house slave. Were they free? Nope. Were they any freer than the slaves out picking cotton in the field? No, they were not. They were a lot more comfortable, but they were not one shred closer to being treated as free human beings. So when you get to modern United States of America, the fact that you have lots of toys and a big screen TV and a cool car, that has nothing to do with whether or not you are a slave to somebody else. It has to do with your comfort level. It may have a lot to do with whether you're going to bother complaining about it. If you're an animal in a big enough cage with enough toys and enough free food and enough stuff to keep you occupied and distracted and healthy, you might not care. You might say, I don't mind this cage. Just fine with me. And if that's the case, I suppose that's sort of understandable. It's also sort of sad that a human being would ever be okay with being somebody else's slave. Now, as it happens, I want to bring up the fact that Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, in his writings, his own autobiographical writings, one of the things he explained was the point at which his owner, quote unquote, the person who claimed to own him, actually told him, I'm going to let you go out and find work out there. And the only condition is you have to give me a percentage of it. In other words, he basically said to Frederick Douglass, you can go out and work in the world, but you have to pay me an income tax. You have to give me a percentage of whatever you earn. And at first, Frederick Douglass was thrilled about this. This is great. This is so much more freedom than I've ever known. I can go out. I can work for myself. I can earn stuff for myself. And it took a while for him to realize and come to the conclusion, this is worse. Yes, a slave, someone who spent most of his life as a slave, came to the conclusion that an income tax is worse than slavery because it keeps intact all of the realities of the slavery and hides them under an illusion of freedom. But what Frederick Douglass came to realize is that if my master can still decide how much of what I earn that he's going to take from me, I'm no more free than I ever was. I'm just a more useful piece of livestock to him, a more productive piece of livestock. And so it took him a while. At first it sounded great. It took him a while to realize an income tax is worse than slavery. And that's coming from someone who lived most of his life as a slave. Now, I realize this is going to be difficult for most people to digest because we don't think of ourselves as slaves, not with all our comforts and all our ability to move about and do pretty many things that we want. They still tell us what we can eat and what we can drink and what we can do and where we can go and where we can work and what we can produce and that sort of thing. So we'll have to, I hear the music coming up, we'll have to save it for the next show when we compare the rest of the fundamental difference between you, Mr. or Mrs. Listener, and a slave back in the days of open slavery before it was hidden under euphemisms and propaganda. This is Larken Rose. You've been listening to Outside the Cage, and be back here next week.